Hey everyone, welcome back. Are you ready for another deep dive? This time we're going deep into Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson.
Yeah, this one's a big one. It's a really fascinating look at why some nations are so much more successful than others.
Right. And it's not just a recent thing either, right? They go way back in history.
Oh, yeah, they look at centuries of history and try to pinpoint the key factors that separate the winners from the losers.
So where do they even start with a question that big? It's got to be more complicated than, oh, they were just in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it's definitely more nuanced than that. They start by debunking some of the common myths about why nations succeed or fail. Like, is it all about geography?
Right, because you always hear, oh, well, they have all the natural resources or they have great weather.
Exactly. But then they hit you with this really interesting example of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
Nogales, wait, remind me what that's about again.
Okay, so you've got these two cities right on the U.S.-Mexico border, literally separated by a fence.
Okay, I vaguely remember this.
The
And
difference in living standards is wild. The U.S. side, it's pretty prosperous. The Mexican side, not so much.
so if it's all about geography, how come these two places, literally right next to each other, are so different?
Right. It kind of throws that whole geography's destiny thing out the window, doesn't it?
It really makes you think. Okay, so what about culture then? A lot of people point to cultural differences to explain these kinds of disparities.
That's another one they tackle head on. And they make a really compelling point. Cultures change, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look at how much our own culture has changed, even in the past few decades.
Exactly. And they use the example of the Middle East. It used to be a global center for knowledge, innovation, you name it.
It's true. I remember learning about all those amazing inventions and discoveries.
Right. Algebra, the astrolabe, even coffee, it all came from that region.
Okay, so if it's not just geography or some inherent cultural trait, what is it then? What's the secret sauce?
That's where things get really interesting. The authors argue that the real key lies in something called institutions.
Institutions, huh?
Yeah,
Like the government, the legal system, that kind of thing.
exactly. They're basically the rules of the game, both in politics and economics. They shape how power is distributed, how resources are allocated, how people interact with each other.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see why that matters. But can you give me a more concrete example? How do these institutions actually play out in the real world?
Sure. The book draws a really important distinction between inclusive and extractive institutions.
Inclusive versus extractive. Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So inclusive institutions, they're like setting up a fair game,
Yeah.
right? Everyone has a chance to participate, to reap the rewards if they work hard and play by the rules.
Okay, so kind of like a level playing field.
Exactly. Think of it like early United States,
Yeah.
with its focus on individual rights, property rights, and a system where power was more distributed.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
It wasn't perfect, of course,
Yeah.
but the basic idea was to create a system where people felt secure enough to invest, innovate, and pursue their ambitions without fear of having it all taken away.
Right, because if you're constantly worried about the rug being pulled out from under you, you're less likely to take risks to try new things.
Exactly. Inclusive institutions, they're like fertile ground for growth and progress.
Okay, that makes sense. So then extractive institutions, those would be the opposite,
Yeah, you could say that.
where the rules are rigged to benefit a select few.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, the rich get richer. Extractive institutions, they're designed to funnel wealth and power to a small elite, often at the expense of everyone else.
So it's not just about the lack of opportunity, it's about actively exploiting others to maintain power.
Exactly. And the book, it gives some chilling examples of this throughout history.
Like what?
Well, take the Spanish conquistadors in Latin America. They weren't exactly known for their fair labor practices.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
They imposed systems designed to extract wealth, to funnel resources back to Spain, often through forced labor, exploiting the indigenous populations.
Basically stealing their land, their resources, their labor, all to enrich themselves.
Exactly. It was a system built on extraction,
Hmm.
on taking from those who had little to no power to resist.
Wow. It's kind of disturbing how often that pattern seems to repeat itself throughout history.
It is. And it's not just a thing of the past either. Those legacies, those extractive systems, they continue to cast a long shadow.
So you're saying those extractive institutions, they can have a ripple effect across generations?
Absolutely. It's like planting a seed in toxic soil.
Ah.
Even if you manage to grow something, it's going to be stunted, unhealthy.
That's a powerful image. But okay, so if inclusive institutions are so great, why don't all countries just adopt them?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. But the book, it offers some really insightful explanations. One of the key concepts they introduce is this idea of institutional drift.
Institutional drift. Okay, I've never heard of that. What is that exactly?
So imagine two ships setting sail, right?
Okay,
And they both start out heading in roughly the same direction.
gotcha.
But there's a slight difference in their course, maybe just a few degrees.
Okay, I'm with you.
At first, you barely notice the difference, but over time, those small variations, they add up.
So even a tiny change in direction can lead to a completely different destination.
Exactly. And that's kind of what happens with institutions. Small, seemingly insignificant differences in the rules of the game, they can accumulate over time, especially during those big historical turning points.
Right, like revolutions, wars, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The authors, they call these turning points critical junctures.
Critical junctures, got it. So give me an example. When has this institutional drift played a major role in shaping a nation's trajectory?
Well, they have this really fascinating section on the Black Death.
The Black Death. You mean that horrible plague that wiped out like a third of Europe's population?
The one and only. Now, you wouldn't think a pandemic would be good for social progress, right?
Not exactly. Sounds kind of like a recipe for chaos and collapse.
You'd think so, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Before the Black Death, Europe was dominated by feudalism. That rigid social structure where peasants were tied to the land with very few rights.
Yeah, I remember learning about that. It didn't sound like a great deal for the peasants.
Not at all. But then the plague hits, and it wipes out a huge chunk of the population.
Right.
Suddenly there's a labor shortage. Those who survived, they have more bargaining power. They can demand better wages, better treatment.
So this horrible tragedy, in a weird way, it actually helped to shift the balance of power.
Exactly. It created an opening for a more equitable system to emerge. Not overnight, of course, and it was still a brutal time to be alive. But that critical juncture, it helped to set in motion a slow but steady shift towards more inclusive institutions in some parts of Europe.
That is fascinating. It really shows how even the most devastating events can have these unintended consequences, these ripple effects that shape the course of history.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of those critical junctures, those moments where societies can either seize the opportunity to create a more just and equitable system, or they can cling to the old ways and stagnate.
So it's not just about the institutions themselves, it's about how they adapt and evolve in response to these major historical events.
Exactly. And sometimes those events, they can expose the flaws in a system, the cracks in the foundation. And when that happens, societies have a choice to make. Do they try to patch things up, to maintain the status quo, or do they take the opportunity to rebuild, to create something stronger, more resilient, and hopefully more just?
It's like that old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly. Crises, they can be opportunities for transformative change. But they can also be opportunities for those in power to further entrench themselves, to tighten their grip.
So it's not just about recognizing those critical junctures, it's about how societies choose to respond to them. And those choices, they have consequences that can reverberate for generations.
Precisely. And that brings us to another really important point the book makes. Path dependence.
Path dependence, okay. Another term I'm not familiar with. Break it down for me.
Basically, it means that the choices made in the past,
Mm-hmm.
they can limit the choices available in the present.
Okay, so like the decisions our ancestors made, they're still shaping our world today.
In many ways, yes. It's like walking down a path in the woods. Every step you take, it makes it harder to turn back, to choose a different direction.
So we're all kind of stuck on this path that was laid out for us by those who came before us.
To a certain extent, yes. But the good news is, it's not entirely deterministic.
Right.
We still have agency. We can still make choices that can alter the course, even if it's just a little bit.
Okay, that's reassuring. So give me an example of this path dependence in action. How has it played out in the real world?
Well, let's go back to the example of the Spanish conquest of Latin America.
Okay.
The conquistadors, they didn't just arrive and say, hey, let's build a fair and just society here.
Right. They came to conquer, to extract wealth, to establish their dominance.
Exactly. And the institutions they created, they were designed to serve that purpose.
So they created a system that was rigged from the start.
Exactly. And those systems, those patterns of extraction, they became deeply ingrained in the fabric of those societies.
And even after the Spanish were gone, those extractive institutions, they persisted.
In many cases, yes, because they created a self-perpetuating cycle.
What do you mean?
Well, those who benefited from the system, They had every incentive to keep it going, right? So they used their power and wealth to influence politics, to shape the laws in their favor.
It's like that saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Exactly. And so even though the players changed, the game remained the same.
So even centuries later, many Latin American countries are still grappling with the legacies of that colonial past.
Absolutely. It's not the only factor, of course, but those early institutions, those patterns of extraction, they cast a long shadow.
It makes you wonder, what would those societies look like today if they had started down a different path, a more inclusive path?
It's a question worth pondering. And it highlights the importance of making the right choices, especially during those critical junctures, because those choices can have ripple effects for generations to come. But it's also important to remember that even though the past can constrain us, it doesn't have to define us.
Okay, so there's still hope. But it sounds like overcoming those legacies of extraction, it's not easy.
Not at all. But the book, it does offer some glimmers of hope. It shows that change is possible, even if it's often slow and difficult.
So there are examples of countries that have managed to break free from that cycle of extraction.
Yes. And those stories, they're incredibly inspiring. They show that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, progress is possible. But it requires a deep understanding of how these systems work, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable world.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. But it's also incredibly important, because it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how the world really works.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for vigilance, for engagement, for a commitment to holding those in power accountable.
Because ultimately, the kind of world we live in, it's not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the institutions we create, and the actions we take.
Beautifully said. And that's a message that's more relevant than ever in today's world.
So we've covered a lot of ground here about how institutions, these rules of the game, can make or break a nation's success. But you kind of left me hanging there. What about those glimmers of hope you mentioned?
Ah, yes, of course. It's not all doom and gloom. The book does highlight some pretty incredible examples of societies that have managed to challenge and even overturn those deep-seated systems of extraction.
Like what? Give me some hope here.
All right, all right. One powerful example is the U.S. South.
The South. You mean with its history of slavery and segregation? That's South.
That's the one. They had a long and brutal history to overcome, but the civil rights movement, that was a testament to the power of collective action, of people demanding a more just and equitable system.
It was a long and difficult struggle, though, right? Not just a quick fix.
Oh, absolutely. It took decades of tireless activism, of people putting their lives on the line to dismantle those Jim Crow laws and chip away at those deeply ingrained extractive institutions.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how much courage it took to stand up to those in power, to demand change when the system seemed so rigged against them.
For sure. And it wasn't just about changing the laws on paper. It was about changing hearts and minds, about shifting the very culture of a society. And that's never easy.
So how did they do it? What were the key factors that allowed for such a profound transformation in the U.S. South?
Well, the courage and determination of the activists themselves, that was absolutely essential. But they didn't do it alone.
Right, because you can't just wish away centuries of injustice. There had to be more to it than that.
Exactly. The federal government, they eventually stepped in, enforcing the law, protecting the rights of all citizens, and ensuring that those hard-won gains couldn't just be rolled back.
So it was a combination of bottom-up pressure and top-down action.
Exactly. It took both grassroots activism and government intervention to break down those barriers and create a more level playing field. And it's still a work in progress, of course, but the progress that's been made is undeniable.
That's incredibly inspiring. It shows that even when faced with these deeply ingrained systems of oppression, change is possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it requires a multifaceted approach. You need people demanding change, leaders willing to listen and act, and institutions that are designed to protect those changes and prevent a slide back into old habits.
It's like a three-legged stool. You need all three legs to be strong and stable.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important point. Institutions, they're not static. They can be shaped and reshaped over time. And it's up to each generation to decide what kind of world they want to live in, what kind of rules they want to play by, and to fight for those changes.
It makes you realize that history, it's not just something that happened in the past, it's something that's still being written today, and we're all a part of that story. Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We've gone from ancient empires to modern-day movements, all through the lens of these institutions.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
So for our listeners who are feeling fired up and ready to learn more, what should they be thinking about? What's our big takeaway?
I'd say this: don't take institutions for granted. Question them, challenge them, and be an active participant in shaping the ones that shape your world. The kind of society we live in, it's not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the institutions we create and support.
That's a powerful message to end on. And for our listeners who want to go even deeper, we highly recommend checking out Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. It's a book that will challenge your assumptions, broaden your horizons, and hopefully inspire you to think differently about the world around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.